The day your own family decides you don't matter might be the day your real life finally begins. I didn't believe those words the morning I stood in Terminal C of Dallas Fort Worth International Airport with a worn carry-on at my feet and my boarding pass clutched so tightly that the edges had begun to curl. Around me, travelers hurried toward security with oversized coffees, excited children, and conversations about vacations, business meetings, and reunions. For everyone else, it was just another ordinary Friday. For me, it was supposed to be the first family vacation we had taken together in nearly 8 years, a week in Maui that my parents had proudly called a chance to reconnect. Looking back now, I realized they had never intended for me to be part of those memories. My name is Ethan Carter. I'm 28 years old, and if you had asked anyone in my family to describe me that morning, they would have all used the same word without hesitation. Loser. My older brother Ryan was the golden child who could do no wrong. He owned a fast-growing real estate company, drove a luxury SUV, and somehow turned every family dinner into another celebration of his latest achievement. My parents practically glowed whenever they talked about him. Meanwhile, I worked as a customer support representative for a small software company, rented a modest apartment outside Fort Worth, and still drove the same 10-year-old sedan I'd bought after college. To my family, success had always been measured by paychecks, titles, and appearances, and by those standards, I never stood a chance. Even before we reached the airport, the jokes had already started. My father laughed when he saw my suitcase and asked if I had borrowed it from a thrift store. My mother sighed dramatically because I wasn't wearing designer sunglasses like Ryan. Ryan himself smiled the way people do when they already know they've won. Every sarcastic comment earned another laugh, and I forced myself to smile because arguing only made things worse. I'd spent years convincing myself that if I stayed patient long enough, someday they'd finally see me differently. Maybe this trip would be that chance. Maybe 1 week together would remind them I wasn't their disappointment. We reached the gate nearly an hour before boarding, and while my parents found seats near the windows, Ryan wandered off with his phone pressed against his ear. I barely noticed until my own phone buzzed with an email notification. At first, I thought it was another travel update. Instead, my stomach dropped as I read the subject line. Your reservation has been canceled. I stared at the screen, convinced there had to be a mistake. I refreshed the airline app 3 times. My flight no longer existed. My seat assignment had disappeared. My boarding pass turned invalid before my eyes. Confused, I walked to the customer service desk where the agent politely typed my confirmation number into her computer. After several seconds, she looked back at me with an apologetic smile. I'm sorry, sir, but this reservation was canceled about 20 minutes ago by someone using the account owner's authorization. My parents looked away the moment I turned toward them. Ryan slowly slipped his phone into his pocket before walking over with the calm confidence of someone who had rehearsed every word. Relax, he said with a shrug. We figured you'd probably ruin the trip anyway. My father chuckled under his breath, while my mother folded her arms as if this were the most reasonable decision in the world. Maybe next year, she said without a hint of regret. You just aren't in the same place in life as the rest of us. Ryan leaned closer, lowering his voice just enough that only I could hear him. Face it, Ethan. You're a loser. We did everyone a favor. None of them looked guilty. None of them hesitated. Within minutes, they gathered their carry-ons, scanned their boarding passes, and disappeared through the boarding lane without looking back even once. I stood alone beside the gate, surrounded by strangers who had unknowingly witnessed the most humiliating moment of my life. I remember watching the aircraft pull away from the terminal, feeling as though everything I'd spent years hoping for had disappeared with it. I had no idea that before the sun went down, the phone call that would change my life forever was already on. It's wet. I remained frozen long after the boarding door closed, staring through the tall airport windows as the aircraft slowly backed away from the gate. The roar of its engines faded into the distance, taking with it the last tiny piece of hope I had been carrying for years. around me. The terminal returned to normal as though nothing unusual had happened. Families laughed over breakfast sandwiches. Business travelers hurried toward connecting flights, and children pressed their faces against the glass, waving excitedly at airplanes they would never remember. The world had moved on within seconds, but I felt trapped inside a moment that refused to end. Eventually, I picked up my suitcase and walked toward the parking garage, trying to convince myself that this was simply another disappointment, another reminder that I should stop expecting my family to become people they had never been. During the drive back to my apartment, my phone remained silent. No apology. No message asking whether I had made it home safely. Not even a sarcastic joke from Ryan. It was as if I had never existed in the first place. By early afternoon, I had unpacked the few clothes I had folded so carefully the night before. The Hawaiian shirts I had bought on clearance looked almost embarrassing hanging back inside my closet. I made myself a cup of coffee even though I was not thirsty and sat by the living room window watching gray clouds slowly drift across the Texas sky. Every few minutes I caught myself opening social media, wondering whether my parents had already posted smiling vacation pictures. Instead, my feed was strangely quiet. Just after 4 o'clock, my television interrupted a baseball game with a breaking news alert. The anchor's calm expression immediately caught my attention. She spoke carefully, explaining that emergency officials were responding to a serious incident involving a commercial flight traveling from Dallas to Honolulu. My heart began pounding before she even mentioned the flight number. It matched the one that had disappeared from my boarding pass only hours earlier. I turned up the volume until it echoed through the apartment. Reporters repeated that information was still limited and authorities were working to contact passengers' relatives before releasing official statements. There were no dramatic images, no speculation, only the unmistakable seriousness in every reporter's voice. I stared at the screen, unable to process what I was hearing. My family had been on that airplane. Less than 8 hours earlier, I had watched them walk away from me without a second thought. Now every memory of that morning replayed itself in perfect detail. Ryan's smug smile, my father's laugh, my mother's cold expression. I wanted to be angry. Instead, all I felt was numb disbelief. My phone finally rang at 5:17. The caller identification displayed an unfamiliar number from Washington, District of Columbia. My hands trembled as I answered. A calm woman introduced herself as a representative working with the airline's Family Assistance Center. She verified my identity before gently asking whether I was related to Daniel, Susan, and Ryan Carter. Hearing their names spoken aloud made everything suddenly feel real. I confirmed that they were my immediate family, and after a brief pause she explained that officials were still gathering verified information and arranging support services for relatives. She emphasized that updates would be provided as soon as they became available and encouraged me not to rely on rumors circulating online. Her professionalism somehow made the situation even harder to accept. When the call ended, I simply sat in silence, staring at the dark television screen after the news coverage had switched back to regular programming. The apartment felt impossibly quiet. I remembered every birthday they had forgotten, every achievement they had dismissed, every holiday where I had smiled through jokes at my expense just because I wanted to belong. Despite everything, they were still my family. Grief arrived in confusing waves, tangled together with guilt and questions that had no answers. As night settled over the city, rain began tapping softly against the windows. I barely noticed another notification appearing on my phone until it vibrated for the third time. This one was not from the airline. It was from a law firm I had never heard of, requesting that I contact them regarding an urgent matter connected to the Carter family estate. I assumed it had been sent by mistake. After all, nobody had ever trusted me with anything important. I could not have imagined that by the next morning, a single meeting inside that law office would force me to question everything I thought I knew about my family, my past, and the life they had spent years convincing me I never deserved. The next morning, I arrived at the downtown law office wearing the only navy blazer I owned, one that had begun to show its age around the sleeves. The building overlooked a quiet plaza where office workers hurried past with coffee cups in their hands, completely unaware that my entire world had unraveled in less than 24 hours. The receptionist greeted me with unusual kindness before escorting me into a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows and a polished walnut table that reflected the morning sunlight. Waiting inside was a gray-haired attorney named Margaret Holloway. She stood to shake my hand, her expression professional yet compassionate. "Mr. Carter," she said softly, "thank you for coming on such short notice." I nodded, unable to find the right words. My thoughts were still consumed by unanswered questions about my parents and Ryan. I assumed this meeting would involve routine legal paperwork or insurance documents connected to the tragedy. Instead, Margaret placed a thick leather folder on the table and gently slid it toward me. "Before we discuss the estate," she began, "there is something you deserve to know." My stomach tightened. She opened the folder to reveal copies of financial records, property agreements, and several notarized documents spanning almost 15 years. At first, none of it made sense. Then she pointed to a familiar address. It was my grandparents' ranch outside Abilene, the place where I had spent every summer as a child until my grandfather passed away. I remembered fishing in the pond with him, repairing old fences, and listening to stories on the porch long after sunset. My parents had always told me the property had been sold because there was no money left to maintain it. Margaret quietly slid another document toward me. It showed that the ranch had never been sold at all. It had remained in the family under a private trust established by my grandfather. Even more surprising, the sole beneficiary listed on the trust was me. I stared at the page, convinced I had misunderstood. "There has to be a mistake," I whispered. Margaret slowly shook her head. "There is no mistake, Ethan." She explained that my grandfather had updated his estate shortly before his death. According to the legal documents, he believed I possessed qualities that could not be measured by income or social status. He had written a personal letter instructing the trustees to protect the property until I reached the age of 28 or until certain financial conditions had been satisfied. My hands trembled as Margaret removed a sealed envelope bearing my grandfather's familiar handwriting. Seeing his name after so many years felt almost unreal. I carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. His words carried the same warmth I remembered from childhood. He wrote that life would eventually reveal people's true character, not through success, but through hardship. He said he had watched me help neighbors without expecting recognition, care for my grandmother during her illness, and treat everyone with respect regardless of their circumstances. Then came the sentence that left me speechless. "If you are reading this, then I hope you finally understand that kindness is never weakness, and I have trusted you with what I could never trust to those who only chase wealth." I lowered the letter, struggling to breathe evenly. For years I had believed I was the forgotten son, the one nobody believed in. Yet the one family member whose opinion mattered most had quietly believed in me all along. Margaret allowed the silence to settle before speaking again. "There is something else." She opened another folder containing correspondence between the trustees and my father. Several letters documented repeated requests from my father to dissolve the trust years before I became eligible to receive it. Every request had been denied because it violated my grandfather's instructions. My father had known the ranch still existed. He had known it belonged to me. He had simply never told me. The room suddenly felt much smaller. Every conversation where my father had mocked my modest apartment, every joke Ryan had made about my paycheck, every lecture about becoming more successful echoed inside my mind. They had spent years calling me a failure while hiding the one thing that had been left specifically for my future. As I sat there trying to absorb the truth, Margaret closed the folders and looked directly into my eyes. "Ethan," she said carefully, "this trust is only the beginning. There are additional documents that explain why your grandfather made these decisions, and I believe once you read them, you will understand that your family was protecting far more than a piece of land. They were protecting a secret that changes everything you thought you knew about your own life. Margaret remained silent for several moments, allowing me to absorb what I had already learned before sliding one final binder across the polished table. Unlike the previous folders, this one was filled with handwritten notes, certified copies of old business agreements, and dozens of letters exchanged between my grandfather and the family's longtime accountant. Your grandfather believed the truth should reach you only when you were mature enough to understand it, Margaret said quietly. He feared that telling you too early would only create more conflict inside your family. I slowly opened the binder, and the first page immediately caught my attention. It contained the original ownership records for Carter Agricultural Supply, the small equipment business my grandfather had built from nothing nearly 40 years earlier. Growing up, I had always believed my father had expanded that company through his own talent before eventually selling it for a comfortable retirement. That was the version repeated at every family gathering. It was treated almost like a legend. But the documents in front of me told an entirely different story. Years before the company was sold, my grandfather had transferred a significant portion of his ownership into the same trust that now belonged to me. Those shares had quietly remained there all this time, accumulating value through investments that neither my father nor Ryan had ever been able to touch. My grandfather had deliberately structured everything so that the assets could never be sold, borrowed against, or redirected without my written approval after I turned 28. I looked up in disbelief. My father knew about this? Margaret gave a slow nod. He knew every detail. I leaned back in my chair, trying to reconcile that answer with the man I thought I knew. If my father had always known about the trust, then every lecture about responsibility, every insult about my salary, every comparison to Ryan suddenly carried an entirely different meaning. They had not been judging me because I lacked potential. They had been frustrated because they could never control what my grandfather had chosen to protect. Margaret carefully turned to another page. Attached was a copy of a letter my father had written nearly 10 years earlier requesting early access to the trust. His argument centered on expanding Ryan's future business ventures, claiming the investment would strengthen the Carter family legacy. My grandfather's attorney had rejected the request in a single paragraph, citing the trust's clear instructions. Underneath the official response, someone had attached one handwritten note from my grandfather. It read, "Character must come before inheritance. Money placed in the wrong hands destroys families. Money placed in steady hands builds futures." I read the sentence 3 times before setting the paper down. Suddenly, dozens of forgotten memories began resurfacing. Ryan insisting that I decline an internship because it paid too little. My father discouraging me from accepting a management training program in another state. My mother repeatedly reminding me that staying close to family mattered more than chasing uncertain opportunities. At the time, I believed they were trying to protect me from failure. Now I wondered whether they had simply wanted me close enough to monitor every step I took until the trust could somehow be challenged. Margaret interrupted my thoughts with another envelope. "This was found inside your grandfather's personal safe," she explained. "He instructed that you read it only after reviewing the financial records." The paper inside had yellowed with age, but his handwriting remained steady and unmistakable. He apologized for the difficult road he believed I would face. He admitted that he had often worried the family's growing obsession with status and appearances would eventually divide those he loved most. Then one sentence made my heart stop. "If your father ever convinces you that your worth depends on his approval, remember this instead. The strongest people are usually the ones underestimated by everyone else." I closed my eyes for a moment as years of self-doubt seemed to loosen their grip all at once. For nearly 3 decades, I had measured my value through my family's opinions. Every criticism had become another reason to believe I would never be enough. Yet the one man who had quietly watched my life unfold had reached the exact opposite conclusion. As I folded the letter, Margaret carefully closed the binder and spoke with unusual seriousness. There is one final matter we have not discussed because it required additional verification after yesterday's events. She placed a slim-sealed folder in front of me with my name typed neatly across the front. This file contains correspondence that was never intended to become public while your parents were alive. It explains several decisions involving your education, your career, and opportunities that unexpectedly disappeared over the years. Ethan, once you read what is inside, you may discover that many of the failures you blamed on yourself were never truly your failures at all. My hands hesitated before opening the final folder. After everything I had learned that morning, I believed nothing else could surprise me. I was wrong. The first document was a copy of an acceptance letter from a respected technology company in Austin dated 6 years earlier. My heart skipped as I recognized my own name at the top. I had applied for that position shortly after graduating from college. I remembered checking my email every day for weeks, convinced I simply had not been good enough when no response ever came. Yet the letter clearly stated that I had been selected for the company's leadership development program, with a starting salary nearly twice what I had been earning at my first job. Tucked behind the letter was another page showing that the offer had been formally declined on my behalf through a phone call from someone claiming to represent my family during a personal emergency. I looked up at Margaret in complete disbelief. I never turned this down. She quietly nodded. We know. My pulse quickened as I continued reading. Another file revealed a graduate scholarship from a university in Colorado. I had interviewed for it during my senior year, but later received a brief rejection email. According to the correspondence inside the folder, the scholarship committee had originally selected me. Days later, they withdrew the award after receiving documentation claiming I had chosen to remain in Texas because of financial obligations to my family. I had never seen those documents before. My breathing became shallow. Every opportunity one thought I had lost because I was not talented enough had quietly disappeared before I even knew it existed. Margaret reached for another envelope. Your grandfather instructed us to preserve every record we could locate, she explained. Inside were copies of emails exchanged between Ryan and my father over several years. They were not hateful or threatening. In many ways, that made them even harder to read. They discussed keeping me close to home because I was more useful nearby. One message from Ryan stood out above all the others. If Ethan leaves Texas, nobody will be around to handle Mom's appointments or help Dad whenever something breaks. Besides, he is comfortable where he is. He does not need bigger dreams. I read the sentence twice before setting the page down. Countless memories suddenly fit together with painful clarity. Every time I had mentioned moving to another city, my parents had reminded me how much they depended on me. Every holiday I skipped with friends because my father needed help repairing a fence or my mother wanted someone to drive her to an appointment. I had believed I was being a good son. I never realized those responsibilities had quietly become invisible chains. The most difficult document came last. It was a handwritten note from my grandfather addressed to the trustees shortly before his passing. He admitted that he had tried several times to persuade my father to let me build my own life. Each conversation had ended the same way. My father insisted that Ryan was destined to become the successful face of the Carter family, while I was better suited to supporting everyone else behind the scenes. My grandfather ended the note with a sentence that stayed with me long after I finished reading. One day Ethan will discover that humility should never be mistaken for lack of ability. I leaned back in my chair, overwhelmed by emotions I could barely identify. Anger was certainly part of it, but so was relief. For the first time in years, I realized that the voice inside my head calling me a failure had never truly been my own. It had been built from countless opinions repeated until they sounded like facts. Margaret gently closed the folder and offered me a glass of water before speaking again. "There is something important you should understand," she said. "These records explain what happened in the past, but they do not have to define your future." She then outlined the trust in practical terms. The ranch remained fully operational under professional management. The investment accounts had grown steadily for years. My grandfather had also established funding specifically for education, entrepreneurship, or any career path I wished to pursue. For the first time since leaving college, I was completely free to choose my own direction. As I stood and walked toward the conference room window, I looked down at the busy streets below. Thousands of strangers were beginning ordinary workdays, each carrying dreams and disappointments I would never know. Yesterday morning, I had believed my life was already written. Now I understood it had barely begun. Just as I prepared to leave, Margaret's assistant entered the room holding a small package that had arrived only minutes earlier by overnight courier. The return address belonged to a private investigator, and attached to the outside was a handwritten note containing only 8 words. "Your grandfather wanted you to receive this last." The package felt surprisingly light as I carried it back to my apartment that afternoon. I placed it on my kitchen table and stared at it for several minutes before carefully cutting through the tape. Inside was a small leather journal, several photographs, and a neatly organized stack of reports prepared by the private investigator. The first page explained that my grandfather had hired the investigator shortly after discovering repeated attempts to interfere with my future opportunities. He had not wanted revenge or public confrontation. Instead, he wanted a complete record preserved in case I ever questioned my own worth. As I turned the pages, I found timelines documenting job offers, scholarship interviews, networking events, and business competitions I had entered over the years. Beside each opportunity was a handwritten note explaining what had happened behind the scenes. Some employers had received misleading phone calls claiming I was no longer interested. Others had been told I had accepted positions elsewhere. A few invitations had simply never reached me because they had been mailed to my parents' address while I was temporarily living there after college. Reading those reports was painful, but something unexpected happened with every page I finished. The weight I had carried for years slowly became lighter. The failures I had replayed in my mind 1,000 times no longer belonged to me. They had been carefully constructed obstacles placed in front of someone who never even knew they existed. That realization did not erase the past, but it changed the story I had been telling myself. 3 weeks later, after completing the necessary legal meetings and helping settle the estate, I drove west toward my grandfather's ranch. The property stretched across rolling Texas hills beneath an endless blue sky. White fences bordered open pastures, and an old red barn stood exactly where I remembered it from childhood. The ranch manager, a friendly man named Walter Briggs, greeted me with a warm handshake. He had worked alongside my grandfather for nearly 30 years and smiled, as though he had been expecting this day for a very long time. Walter showed me around the property, explaining how the ranch had remained profitable through cattle leases, renewable energy agreements, and carefully managed investments. My grandfather had quietly modernized the operation years earlier without changing its traditional character. Standing on the porch as the evening sun settled across the fields, I felt something I had not experienced in years. Peace. There was no pressure to impress anyone. No comparisons. No sarcastic comments. Just open land and the quiet confidence that I finally had room to breathe. Over the following months, I made a decision that surprised nearly everyone who knew me. I resigned from my customer support job, enrolled in an executive business program funded through the trust, and began studying entrepreneurship, finance, and agricultural technology. For the first time, I was learning because I wanted to grow rather than because I was trying to prove myself to someone else. I also spent weekends working alongside Walter, discovering that leadership looked very different from what Ryan had always described. It was less about being the loudest person in the room and more about listening carefully, solving problems, and earning people's trust one conversation at a time. As my confidence grew, so did my ambitions. Together with Walter and a small group of local partners, I developed a plan to expand the ranch into a regional supplier specializing in sustainable farming equipment and agricultural consulting. The trust provided the initial capital, but every major decision required my approval. Each contract I signed reminded me that responsibility felt completely different when it was built on respect instead of fear. Nearly a year passed before I realized something remarkable. Entire weeks went by without me thinking about Ryan or my parents. Their opinions no longer shaped my mornings or followed me into bed at night. Instead, my days were filled with meetings, construction projects, community events, and employees who genuinely believed in the future we were building together. One crisp autumn afternoon, while reviewing blueprints inside the renovated ranch office, my assistant entered carrying a business magazine that had just arrived in the mail. Our company had been featured in a statewide article highlighting innovative rural businesses transforming local economies. I smiled quietly before setting the magazine aside. Recognition felt nice, but it was no longer the goal. The greatest victory was discovering that my life no longer depended on anyone else's approval. Just as I prepared to leave for the evening, my office phone rang. The caller identified herself as a federal transportation investigator following up on records connected to the flight from the previous year. She politely explained that a newly uncovered witness statement required them to reopen part of the timeline surrounding the passenger manifest. Then she said one sentence that made every thought in my head come to a complete stop. "Mr. Carter, there is evidence suggesting your canceled reservation may not have been a simple family decision after all." For a long moment I could not answer. I simply stared through the office window at the golden fields stretching toward the horizon while the investigator waited patiently on the other end of the line. Finally, I managed to ask what she meant. Her voice remained calm and measured. She explained that the agency had recently completed a review of archived airport security records after receiving new information from a former airline employee. During that review, investigators discovered an unusual sequence of events involving my reservation. According to the official timeline, my ticket had indeed been canceled through my family's travel account. However, less than 4 minutes later, another reservation had been created under my name using the exact same flight information. That second reservation had then been canceled less than 60 seconds afterward by someone using a completely different access point inside the airport. The second cancellation immediately triggered an automated system that permanently released my seat to standby. "Passengers, we do not know who made the second cancellation," the investigator admitted. "That is why we are contacting you." After ending the call, I sat in silence trying to understand why anyone outside my family would have cared whether I boarded that airplane. Ryan had openly wanted to leave me behind, but the second transaction suggested someone else had intervened after his decision. The timing seemed too precise to be a coincidence. 2 days later, I traveled to Dallas for a meeting with the investigators. They welcomed me into a conference room where several printed timelines, airport maps, and reservation logs covered one wall. A transportation specialist carefully walked me through every recorded action connected to my ticket. Ryan's cancellation had originated from his mobile device exactly as expected. The second activity, however, came from a public terminal located only a short walk from our departure gate. Security cameras had captured dozens of travelers passing through that area, but the video quality was not clear enough to identify the individual responsible. Then the lead investigator showed me something I had not expected. A gate supervisor had submitted a written statement months after the incident. She remembered an older gentleman approaching the counter moments before boarding ended. He had asked whether a passenger named Ethan Carter had successfully boarded. When she explained that my reservation had already been canceled, he simply smiled, thanked her, and quietly walked away. She described him as wearing a brown jacket, a Western-style hat, and carrying a polished wooden cane. My heart immediately skipped a beat. That description sounded remarkably similar to my grandfather. But that was impossible. My grandfather had passed away years before the trip. The investigator gently shook her head before I could even ask the question. "We verified the dates," she said. "It could not have been your grandfather." She handed me a professionally enhanced still image taken from a security camera positioned near the information desk. The man's face remained partially hidden beneath the brim of his hat, but something about his posture looked strangely familiar. I could not explain why. As I studied the photograph, another investigator entered carrying a newly received personnel file from the airline. Inside was an employee statement submitted only weeks earlier by a retired customer service representative. According to her account, the unidentified older man had approached her after learning that my reservation had disappeared. He reportedly asked whether there was any way to restore my seat. When she explained that boarding had already begun and the system no longer allowed manual reinstatement, he quietly thanked her before leaving. He never identified himself. He never argued. He simply seemed deeply disappointed. Leaving the federal office that afternoon, I carried more questions than answers. Someone had apparently wanted me on that airplane, while someone else had worked just as hard to keep me off it. Yet the investigators emphasized there was no evidence of criminal intent connected to the reservation changes. Instead, they believed the second individual had been trying to help me after discovering what had happened. That possibility stayed with me during the long drive back to the ranch. Late that evening, unable to stop thinking about the mysterious man, I searched through several old boxes stored in my grandfather's study. Most contained family photographs, tax records, and faded holiday cards. Near the bottom of the final box, I discovered an envelope labeled simply, "Friends Worth Remembering." Inside were dozens of letters exchanged over several decades. One photograph immediately caught my attention. It showed my grandfather standing beside another older man wearing a brown jacket, a Western-style hat, and holding the exact same polished wooden cane described by the airline employee. Written neatly across the back of the photograph were 6 words that sent a chill through my entire body. Harold Mason, the only man I trusted. The next morning, I drove to the address listed in one of my grandfather's old letters, a modest white farmhouse about 40 miles from the ranch. The mailbox still displayed the name Mason in faded black paint. I almost turned around twice before finally walking up the front steps and knocking on the door. After several moments, an elderly man opened it. His silver hair was thinner than in the photograph, but the kind eyes, brown jacket, and polished wooden cane left no doubt. "Mr. Harold Mason?" I asked. He studied my face for only a second before a gentle smile appeared. "You must be Ethan," he replied. "I have been wondering when you would find me." Those words immediately erased any doubt that this meeting had been planned long before I understood its importance. Harold invited me inside, where framed photographs covered nearly every wall. Many showed him standing beside my grandfather during fishing trips, county fairs, and community events stretching back decades. They had clearly shared a lifelong friendship. After pouring 2 cups of coffee, Harold sat across from me and quietly admitted that he had made the trip to Dallas on the morning of my family's flight. My grandfather had asked him years earlier to keep an eye on me if anything unusual ever happened after his death. Harold explained that he had maintained occasional contact with Margaret Holloway and the trustees without my knowledge, not to interfere with my life, but to honor an old promise. When Margaret informed him that my entire family had unexpectedly booked a vacation together only days after the trust officially transferred into my name, something about the timing made him uneasy. He decided to travel to the airport simply to make sure everything appeared normal. "I never believed anyone was in danger," Harold said honestly. "I only wanted to see you with my own eyes." He then described arriving just in time to notice an argument near the departure gate. From a distance, he watched Ryan speaking sharply while I stood alone holding my phone. Harold could not hear the conversation, but he clearly recognized the expression on my face because he had seen it before. It was the same look your grandfather wore whenever someone he loved disappointed him, he said softly. After I walked away toward customer service, Harold approached the gate and learned that my reservation had been canceled. Believing there had been some misunderstanding, he attempted to have my seat restored. By the time he reached the airline counter, the system no longer allowed changes. He never intended to interfere with my family's plans. He simply wanted to make certain I had been treated fairly. I asked about the mysterious second reservation created under my name. Harold slowly nodded. That was me, he admitted without hesitation. I hoped the airline computer would restore your ticket if I started a new reservation using the same information. I was never very good with modern technology. Instead of helping, his unsuccessful attempt had accidentally created the confusing electronic record investigators discovered years later. Hearing the explanation brought an unexpected sense of relief. The mystery that had occupied my thoughts for months was not evidence of a hidden conspiracy, but the final act of kindness from someone honoring his promise to my grandfather. Harold disappeared into another room and returned carrying a weathered wooden box. Inside were dozens of handwritten letters my grandfather had mailed during the final years of his life. Many discussed ordinary things such as weather, cattle prices, and old memories. Others focused entirely on me. My grandfather often wrote about how proud he was whenever he heard I had helped neighbors, volunteered in the community, or stayed patient despite difficult circumstances. One passage stood out more than any other. Ethan may never become the richest man in Texas, my grandfather had written. But if he keeps his integrity, he will become something far more valuable. The world has plenty of successful people. It will always need more trustworthy ones. I felt my eyes grow wet as I carefully folded the letter. For so many years I had chased approval from people who measured life through comparison. Meanwhile, the people who truly loved me had been quietly measuring something entirely different. Before I left, Harold placed one hand on my shoulder and smiled. Your grandfather never wanted you to spend your life proving anyone wrong, he said. He wanted you to spend it proving yourself right. As I drove back toward the ranch beneath the wide Texas sky, I finally understood that carrying resentment any longer would only keep me tied to a past that no longer controlled me. The greatest justice was not exposing every mistake my family had made. It was building the life they never believed I could create and honoring the people who had believed in me from the very beginning. 5 years passed more quickly than I ever imagined. The ranch had grown into one of the most respected agricultural businesses in the region, creating jobs for dozens of families across West Texas, while helping local farmers adopt new technology without losing the traditions that had shaped their communities for generations. Every expansion we completed carried the same principle my grandfather had believed in. Success meant little if it was not shared with others. We established scholarship programs for rural students, partnered with community colleges, and offered paid internships to young people who reminded me of myself years earlier, hardworking individuals who only needed someone willing to believe in them. Whenever I interviewed new employees, I never asked where they came from or how impressive their resumes looked. Instead, I asked them what kind of person they hoped to become. Those conversations always mattered far more than titles or salaries ever could. Harold remained one of my closest friends, visiting the ranch every Saturday morning for coffee on the porch. We often laughed about his unsuccessful attempt to restore my airline reservation, and he always insisted that modern computers were far more stubborn than any ranch horse he had ever trained. Margaret eventually retired from practicing law, but before doing so she handed the trust entirely over to me with a smile that reflected quiet satisfaction. Your grandfather made the right decision, she said during our final meeting. Hearing those words from someone who had witnessed the entire journey felt like closing a chapter that had remained unfinished for years. One autumn afternoon, I received an invitation to speak at a leadership conference in Dallas about resilience, entrepreneurship, and rebuilding after personal loss. I almost declined. Public speaking had never been comfortable for me. Then I remembered how many opportunities one had once allowed fear to steal from me, and I accepted. The conference happened to be held only a few miles from the airport where everything had changed. After my presentation ended, I found myself driving there without planning to. The terminals looked almost identical to the way I remembered them. Travelers hurried through the entrance carrying backpacks, rolling suitcases, and cups of coffee. Families hugged one another before departures while children laughed as airplanes climbed into the bright afternoon sky. Standing near the large windows overlooking the runways, I quietly reflected on the frightened man I had once been. Back then, I believed being left behind meant my life had ended before it had truly begun. I now understood that being left behind had simply forced me onto a different path, one I never would have chosen but would never trade. My phone vibrated with a message from the ranch. A group of scholarship recipients had just arrived for their annual orientation, and they were waiting to meet me before touring the property. I smiled, slipped my phone back into my pocket, and started walking toward the exit. As I passed the same terminal where my family had once disappeared from my life, I felt no bitterness. There was sadness, certainly, because no one wishes for relationships to end the way ours had. But there was also gratitude. My parents had taught me what constant comparison could do to a family. Ryan had shown me how dangerous pride could become when it replaced compassion. My grandfather, Harold, Margaret, and countless others had taught me something far greater. Real wealth is measured by the people whose lives become better because you were part of them. Before leaving the airport, I paused one final time to watch another airplane lift smoothly into the wide Texas sky. Years earlier, I had believed my future was disappearing with a departing flight. Now I realized that my future had actually been waiting on the ground all along, patiently giving me the chance to become someone stronger, wiser, and kinder than I ever imagined possible. If there is one lesson my journey has taught me, it is this: never allow someone else's opinion to become the definition of your life. People can underestimate your potential, overlook your kindness, or fail to recognize your value. But none of those judgments become true unless you choose to believe them. Sometimes the greatest opportunity arrives disguised as rejection. The most meaningful relationships are the ones quietly standing beside you instead of cheering the loudest, and the life you are meant to build begins only after the one you expected falls apart. I took one last look through the airport window, whispered a quiet thank you to my grandfather, and walked toward the parking lot with complete confidence, knowing that I was no longer searching for anyone else's approval because I had finally found something far more important. I had found myself.